At 62, after 35 years of marriage, Eloise Thornberry learned that her husband had been planning her replacement the way a man plans the renovation of a kitchen, quietly, efficiently, with the help of a younger woman named Sloane Beaufort and a lawyer who had already drawn up the papers before Eloise was told there was anything to discuss. Garrett took the house she had paid half the mortgage on for 19 years. He took the savings account they had built together since the Reagan administration. He took the friends who had come to their dinner parties for decades, the country club membership, and the old golden retriever named Boone who had slept at the foot of her bed every winter for 10 years. What he left her with, and this was the detail Eloise would carry inside her chest like a small bright coal for the rest of her life, was a smirk and a deed to a falling down cottage on the coast of Maine that her grandmother had left her decades ago and that everyone in the family agreed was worthless. He thought he was throwing her into the sea. He did not know that her grandmother had buried something inside the walls of that cottage. He did not know that what was hidden there would within 2 short years bring marine biologists and journalists and a much humbled ex-husband to her front door, asking hat in hand to be let in. But all of that was still ahead of her. On the morning the world ended, Eloise Thornberry was only making coffee. That detail would stay with her. Years later, when the cameras came and the strangers asked her to tell the story, she would always begin in the same place. The grinder was running, the kettle was hissing, the kitchen smelled like the dark French roast Garrett preferred, the one she had long since stopped enjoying, but kept buying because he was particular about it. The dog, an old white terrier she had inherited from her sister in the spring, was asleep in a square of October sunlight on the slate floor. His name was Pebble, and he was the only living creature in that house who still belonged to her, though she did not yet know it. The kitchen was 1,600 square feet of soft gray cabinetry and imported tile. Garrett had insisted on the imported tile. He had insisted on a great many things in their 35 years together, and Eloise, who had been raised by a mother who believed a good wife smoothed over the rough edges of a man's wanting, had agreed and agreed and agreed until agreement was no longer something she chose, but something her body did, the way her lungs took in air. She was 62 years old. Her hair, which had been the color of dark honey when Garrett married her, was now the color of pewter. She wore it short. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She had given up running 10 years ago because her left knee had decided it was done, but she still walked every morning down the blue stone path to the mailbox and back. She had a master's degree in art history that she had never used. She had wanted children. They had not come. She had stopped wanting them, eventually the way a person stops watching for a letter that has never been answered. That was who Eloise Thornberry was on the morning the kettle screamed. Garrett came in through the side door from the garage. She heard the door before she saw him, and her shoulders did the small, involuntary lift they had been doing for 35 years whenever Garrett entered a room. Then she heard the other footsteps, 2 pairs, men's shoes on the slate. She turned from the stove. There were 3 of them. Garrett in his charcoal overcoat and his tan club tie, a thin man in a gray suit she had never seen before, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. A third man, younger, soft around the middle, with a financial advisor's watchful blandness, holding a phone in his palm like a small dead bird. "Ellie," Garrett said. He did not meet her eyes. The thin man stepped forward. "Mrs. Thornberry," he said, "my name is Desmond Pierce. I represent your husband. May we sit down?" The kettle was still screaming. She turned and switched off the burner. She turned back. The 3 men were already arranging themselves at her breakfast table without waiting for her answer, the way men arrange themselves in rooms they have decided in advance belong to them. Eloise took down 4 cups. She set out cream and sugar. She poured the coffee. She set a cup in front of each of them the way her mother had taught her to do for guests. Even guests, it turned out, who had come into her kitchen to ruin her. She sat down at her own table. She listened. She listened to a man with a clipped, lawyerly voice explain that the house which had her name on the deed alongside Garrett's was being treated as a marital asset. That because Garrett had been the higher earner across the past 2 decades, he was entitled, under the laws of the state of Connecticut and under the terms of an agreement Eloise had signed when she was 27 years old and in love, to keep it. She listened to him explain that the joint savings, which contained among other things a small inheritance from her own mother and a quiet little IRA Eloise had built from her year's substitute teaching at the middle school, had been moved 8 months ago into accounts that, due to certain technicalities, were now considered separate property. She listened to him use the phrase a fair and equitable settlement and then quote a number. The number was less than what Garrett had spent the previous year on the new pickup truck he kept at the second house in Vermont. She listened to Garrett finally speak near the end. When Desmond Pierce had folded his hands on his portfolio and gone quiet, Garrett cleared his throat and looked for the first time at her. "I don't love you anymore, Ellie," he said. "I haven't for a long time. I'm sorry." He was not sorry. She could tell by the angle of his shoulders. He was relieved. He was relieved to have finally said the sentence out loud in front of witnesses with a paper trail. He was a man who had been carrying a heavy box up a long set of stairs, and he had just set it down. She picked up her coffee. Her hands were not shaking, which surprised her. She took a sip. It was too hot. She drank it anyway because it gave her something to do with her mouth other than scream. "How long?" she said. Desmond Pierce coughed and looked at his pen. The financial advisor found something interesting on the toe of his shoe. Garrett blinked. "How long what?" he said. "How long has she been in our bed?" The kitchen went still. "Mrs. Thornberry," the lawyer said, "that's not particularly relevant to the—" "I'm not asking you," Eloise said. She did not raise her voice. She did not even look at him. She was looking at her husband. "I'm asking my husband, how long Garrett?" The silence stretched. Pebble lifted his head from his patch of sunlight. He looked at the men. He looked at Eloise. He put his head back down on his paws very slowly, and there was something in the gesture, in the careful way the old dog withdrew himself from the room, that made Eloise's throat close. 2 years, Garrett said. 2 years. She let the number drop into the well of her body and waited for it to hit bottom. She waited a long time. It never did. "Sloan," she said. It was not a question. She had met the woman once. She had met her at the country club Christmas party in December. Sloan Beaufort, 28 years old, an associate at the same investment firm where Garrett sat on the board. Tall, slim, wearing an emerald green dress with cap sleeves. Eloise had complimented the dress. Sloan had thanked her warmly, and they had stood for perhaps 4 minutes by the bar talking about nothing, and Eloise had thought, what a lovely young woman, and she had refilled Garrett's drink and carried it back to him across the room. Garrett nodded once. He still would not look at her. Eloise put down the coffee cup. She stood up. She crossed to the sink. She picked up the 4 cups, all of them, and rinsed them one by one slowly in cold water. She set each one upside down on the wooden drying rack. She washed her hands. She dried them on the dish towel that said, "Live, Laugh, Love," in cursive, a gift from Garrett's sister 3 Christmases ago that Eloise had always quietly despised. She turned around. "Get out of my kitchen," she said. Her voice was calm. It was so calm, it sounded to her own ears almost gentle. "All 3 of you, right now, get out of my kitchen." They got out. Desmond Pierce left his card on the table. Garrett did not say goodbye. The side door closed behind them, and the kitchen was quiet again, and the kettle was cooling on the dead burner, and Pebble was looking up at her from his square of sunlight with the patient, sorrowful eyes of a dog who has just watched something break inside the only person he loves, Eloise sat down on the floor. She did not cry. She would cry later. For 4 days she would cry packing in the empty rooms of a house that had ceased with one sentence in a leather portfolio to be hers. But on the floor of her kitchen that morning, she did not cry. She put her hand on the slate tile, which was cold, against her palm, and she breathed in and out very slowly, and she thought about her grandmother. She thought about her grandmother because her grandmother was the only person she could think of who had ever sat on a kitchen floor in a moment like this. Her grandmother, Cordelia Thornberry, who had lived alone in a cottage on a granite bluff in Maine, who had buried 2 husbands and raised 3 daughters and outlived 2 of them, who had died in 1998 in a brass bed she had carried up the stairs by herself when she was 41 years old. Eloise had been at a fundraising gala in Greenwich the night her grandmother died. Garrett had not wanted to miss the gala. Eloise had not insisted. She had been 36 years old, and she had still believed, on some level, that the world was fundamentally a fair place, and that her grandmother, who had always seemed indestructible in her wool sweaters and her flour-dusted hands, would simply wait until the gala was over before she died. Her grandmother had not waited. Sitting on the kitchen floor at 62, Eloise understood perhaps for the first time that her grandmother had not been waiting for anything. Cordelia Thornberry had lived a life that did not ask Eloise's permission to end. She got up off the floor. She made another cup of coffee. She drank it standing at the window, looking out at the back garden where the maples had turned. She picked up Desmond Pierce's card and read it. She set it down. She picked up her phone and called her own lawyer, a woman named Henrietta Voss, whom Eloise had hired 4 years ago for an entirely unrelated matter, and who, it would turn out, had been quietly waiting for Eloise to call her about this particular matter for some time. By Friday, she had packed 2 suitcases. She had packed her grandmother's sewing box. She had packed a wooden chest of letters she had not opened in 40 years. She had packed Pebble's bed and his food and his 3 favorite toys. Garrett had said through the lawyers that she could keep the dog. It was the only thing he had given her, without a fight, and she suspected correctly that it was because Sloane Beaufort was allergic to terriers. She also took from a manila folder in the back of the filing cabinet in Garrett's study a single piece of paper. It was a deed. It was made out in her name only. It described a parcel of land in Wrenhaven Bluff, Maine, comprising approximately 1 3/4 acres, including a residential structure described in the county assessor's notes as uninhabitable. Recommend demolition or sale of land value only. The assessed value of the property was $18,000. Garrett, when the lawyers had reviewed the marital assets, had laughed. He had actually laughed. Sitting at the breakfast table in her kitchen with her coffee in his hand, he had laughed a short, dismissive sound and said, "That dump, she can have that. I wouldn't take it if you paid me." Eloise had not argued. She had folded the deed and put it in the pocket of her cardigan. On Friday morning, the 3rd of October, she loaded the Subaru. Pebble climbed onto the passenger seat the way he had been climbing onto passenger seats for 10 years, with the slow, careful dignity of an old dog who has decided that wherever this woman is going, he is going there with her. Eloise put the deed in the glove compartment. She did not say goodbye to the house. She did not look back at it in the rearview mirror as she pulled out of the driveway and turned east toward the coast. She drove because she had nowhere else to go. She drove because the deed in the glove compartment was the only piece of paper in the world that said her name and only her name. She drove because her grandmother, who had built a house with her own hands on a granite bluff in Maine, was the only person Eloise could imagine sitting across from at a kitchen table now, and the only kitchen table where Eloise could imagine her grandmother sitting was in the house her grandmother had built. The drive took 6 hours. She had not driven that far alone in 20 years. Garrett had always insisted on driving. He had said her left foot tapped the brake too often. He had said she drove like a woman who was always expecting to be hit. Maybe she did. She did not care anymore. She had been hit. There was no longer anything to expect. The first 3 hours were highway. She kept the radio off. Pebble slept curled in a tight white knot on the passenger seat, his nose tucked under one paw, breathing the slow, even breath of a dog who had no idea his life had just been overturned. Eloise watched the road and let her mind go where it wanted. It wanted to go everywhere. It wanted to go to the morning Garrett had proposed on a porch in Cape Cod when he was 29 and she was 27, and he had been so nervous he had dropped the ring once in the grass before he could get the question out. It wanted to go to the year they had tried for a baby, and then the year after, and then the year after that, until the doctors had run out of things to suggest, and Garrett had begun to refer to the subject in the past tense, the way men refer to wars they have decided they have lost. It wanted to go to the Christmas in 1992 when Garrett had given her a pearl necklace and she had cried, and he had thought she was crying because she was happy, and she had let him think that, because the truth was she had been crying because for one bright, clean moment, holding the pearls in her hands in the lamplight, she had believed completely that her husband loved her. And the fact that she had believed it so completely had broken her heart in a way she would not understand for 30 more years. It wanted to go to the country club Christmas party. The emerald green dress. What a lovely young woman. The drink Eloise had carried back to her husband across the room. She did not cry. She had cried herself dry over the 4 days of packing. Now there was only a kind of hollow forward motion in her, like a small boat that has cut its anchor and is drifting on a current it cannot see. Around hour 4, the highway thinned into a 2-lane road. She passed a town called Crestmore. She passed a town called Pelbridge. She passed a town with no sign at all, only a closed gas station and a single yellow streetlight burning in the daylight. The trees changed. The pines pressed closer to the road. She rolled the window down a crack, and she smelled for the first time in 35 years the cold, wet salt of the Atlantic. Something cracked open inside her chest. She had not expected it. She had thought she was empty. She pulled the car onto the shoulder. She put her forehead against the steering wheel. She did not cry exactly. She made a sound she had never made before, a low, rough sound that came from somewhere underneath her ribs, somewhere she had not known there were sounds. Pebble lifted his head and looked at her with the patient confusion of an old dog. After a moment, he stood up, climbed across the center console, and pressed his small white head against her collarbone. She sat on the side of the road with a dog in her lap and let the salt wind come in through the cracked window. When she could drive again, she drove. The road to Wren Haven Bluff was the kind of road the state had stopped maintaining sometime in the 1980s. The asphalt was cracked and patched. Mailboxes leaned at unlikely angles. She passed a barn that had collapsed inward on itself like a hand closing into a fist. She passed 3 lobster traps stacked at the end of a driveway. She passed a hand-painted sign that said, "Fresh eggs" in faded red letters, with no house in sight to sell them from. The village of Wren Haven Bluff was 1 street long, a post office, a small white clapboard church, a general store with a porch, and 2 old men in folding chairs, and a yellow cat asleep on a flour barrel, a bakery with a hand-lettered sign that said Purnell's, a library no bigger than a 2-car garage. The harbor below the village held perhaps 20 fishing boats, most of them tied up, some of them visibly not seaworthy. The whole village was built on a granite shelf above the water, and the houses leaned toward the sea the way old people lean toward a fire. She did not stop. She drove through the village and out the other side, following the directions her grandmother had written on the back of a Christmas card in 1996, directions Eloise had kept for 28 years in a manila envelope at the back of her hope chest for no reason she could name. Past the chapel, right at the split rock, down the dirt road until you think you've gone too far. Then keep going. She kept going. The dirt road was a tunnel of overgrown spruce. Branches scraped the roof of the Subaru. The road climbed and curved and climbed again. She passed a single mailbox with the name Thornberry, faded almost to nothing, her grandmother's name. Eloise had not seen the name written down anywhere in 26 years. The road ended at a gate. The gate was rusted shut. She got out with Pebble at her heels and pushed at the gate with both hands until it groaned open just wide enough for her to walk through. Driftwood Hollow Cottage sat on a bluff above the cove. It was worse than she had remembered, and she had remembered it being bad. The shingles had gone silver and were lifting in places like the loose feathers of an old bird. The porch sagged on its left side. 2 of the front windows were broken. A third was held together with what looked like decades-old duct tape. A wild rose had grown up through a hole in the porch floor and was blooming late in the season with 3 small pink flowers. The roof was patched with a blue tarp that had torn in some recent storm. Beyond the cottage, the land sloped down to a cliff, and beyond the cliff was the cove. The cove was gray and moving and alive. Eloise stood at the gate with her hands on her hips and looked at her inheritance. She thought, I cannot live here. She thought immediately after, I have nowhere else to go. A voice behind her said, You lost. She turned. The man was perhaps 70. He was small and bowed and wore a wool sweater that had been patched at both elbows with mismatched yarn. His hair was white and stiff with salt. He held a coil of rope in one hand and a steel thermos in the other. He was looking at her with the suspicious kindness of a man who had lived alone for a long time and was not entirely sure he wanted that to change. I'm not lost, Eloise said. I'm Cordelia Thornberry's granddaughter. This is my house. The man considered her for a long moment. Cordelia's been dead 26 years, he said. I know. House has been empty all that time. I know. He nodded slowly. He set the thermos down on a fence post. He looked at the cottage. He looked at her. He looked at Pebble, who was sitting very politely on Eloise's left boot, returning the man's gaze with grave terrier dignity. I'm Alistair, he said. Alistair Quimby. I live in the green place down the road. Your grandmother and my wife were friends. My wife passed in 2003. He paused. Front doors swelled shut. You'll need a crowbar. I've got one. He turned and walked back down the dirt road without waiting for an answer. Eloise watched him go. Pebble pressed against her ankle. She put her hand down and touched his small, warm head. She looked at the cottage again. The wind came up off the cove and lifted her hair from the back of her neck, and she breathed in the salt and the spruce and the particular whetstone smell of the Maine coast. And somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the disbelief, something in her chest answered the wind, not with words, with a small surprised lift, the way a gull lifts off water. She stayed. Alistair Quimby came back 10 minutes later with a crowbar, a flashlight, and a roll of clear plastic sheeting. He did not ask permission. He climbed the sagging porch steps the way a man climbs, steps he has climbed before, set the flashlight down on the railing and worked the crowbar into the seam of the front door with the patient strength of someone who had pried open many things in his life. The door cracked open on the third pull. A breath of cold, trapped air came out. It smelled of mildew and old paper and something faintly sweet that Eloise could not place. Lamp oil, Alistair said, as if she had asked. Cordelia kept lamp oil in the back pantry, probably still some there. He stepped inside ahead of her and shone the flashlight around. Eloise followed with Pebble at her heels. The cottage had 4 rooms. A front parlor with a fieldstone fireplace and a horsehair sofa under a yellow dust sheet, a kitchen with a black cast iron stove, a soapstone sink, and a hand pump for water that Alistair tested by working the handle 5 times before a brown stream came out, then 10 times before the stream ran clear. A small bedroom with an iron bed frame and a folded quilt at the foot, a back pantry with shelves of mason jars, some still holding what looked like preserves, so old they had gone black. The walls were hung with photographs and framed pencil sketches. The floors were wide pine boards, scarred and beautiful. A spider had built a web across one of the windows so thick it caught the light like lace. Eloise stood in the middle of the parlor and put her hand over her mouth. "It's not as bad as the outside makes it look," Alistair said. He was watching her carefully. "Roof's the worst of it. Stove still works. Pump still works. Walls are sound. Your grandmother built this place to last." Eloise lowered her hand. "My grandfather built it," she said. Alistair Quimby looked at her for a long moment. There was no contempt in his face. There was only a kind of quiet, almost careful surprise. The surprise of a man who has just realized that something he assumed was common knowledge had in fact been kept from someone for a very long time. "No, ma'am," he said gently. "He helped. She built it. Cordelia laid every floorboard in this house. I was 12 years old. I watched her do it. My father was the one who lent her the saw." Eloise stared at him. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She put her hand on the back of the horsehair sofa to steady herself. She had not known that. In 35 years of marriage, she had told Garrett many things about her grandmother. She had told him Cordelia was a strong woman. She had told him Cordelia had lived alone on the coast of Maine and grown her own vegetables and split her own firewood into her 70s. And Garrett had always nodded the way men nod at things they intend to forget. And once very early on he had said, "Sweetheart, all those old fishermen's wives think they built the houses." And he had laughed and she had let it go because she had been 28 years old and in love, and she had let him write over the slow course of 3.5 decades a smaller and smaller version of her grandmother into her head, standing in the parlor of a house her grandmother had built with her own hands at the age of 24, while a stranger in a wool sweater shone a flashlight on the floorboards her grandmother had laid. Eloise Thornberry thought with a quiet that surprised her. What else? What else had he made small? What else had she let him? Alistair Quimby stayed for an hour. He showed her the trick to the stove. He showed her the trick to the pump. He showed her the place out back where the well house was, and the place under the porch where Cordelia had kept her tools still there, oiled cloth still wrapped around the heads, as if Cordelia had simply stepped inside for a cup of tea 26 years ago and forgotten to come back. He patched the broken front window with the plastic sheeting and a roll of duct tape from his truck. He would not accept the $20 bill she tried to press into his hand. "Pay me when you've got it to spare," he said, "and not before." He paused on the porch. He looked at her for a long moment in the failing afternoon light. He looked like a man considering whether to say something that once said could not be unsaid. "She talked about you," he said finally. "Cordelia, often." He nodded once. "She used to say to my wife, that girl down in Connecticut, that husband of hers, she doesn't see him yet. She will." Eloise stood very still. "She said that more than once." He touched the brim of an invisible hat and walked down off the porch and back down the dirt road, and Eloise stood on the sagging porch of a cottage her grandmother had built with her own hands, and she watched the small white-haired figure of Alistair Quimby disappear into the spruce, and the wind came up off the cove again and pulled at her hair, and somewhere very deep inside her chest, a stone that had been sitting on her lungs for 35 years shifted just a little and let in air. The light through the patched window was the color of old butter. Pebble was already asleep on the horsehair sofa as if he had lived there his whole life. Eloise sat down on the floor in front of the cold fireplace and ate a granola bar from her coat pocket. She did not turn on a lamp. She listened for a long time to the cove moving against the rocks below the cliff, a sound she had not realized her body had been missing for 35 years. That was her first night. The second day she swept. The third day she swept again because the dust came back and because she did not yet know what else to do. The fourth day she walked down into the village and bought eggs and bread and a jar of honey from a round-faced woman at the bakery whose hand-lettered sign said, Purnell's. The woman behind the counter had flour on her forearms and a long gray braid down her back. Her name was Maren Voss. She asked Eloise where she was staying, and when Eloise said the old Thornberry place, Maren Voss put down the bread knife. She looked at Eloise for a long moment, then her mouth softened. You're Cordelia's girl, she said. Granddaughter. Yes, I knew her. I was a little thing. She used to come into my mother's bakery and trade jars of preserves for bread. She had hands like sandpaper. Maren Voss smiled, which made her face crease up around the eyes in a way that made Eloise's throat tighten. Welcome home, sweetheart. You take that loaf. I won't take your money for it. Not on your first week. Eloise tried to argue. Maren Voss did not let her. Eloise walked back up the dirt road carrying a free loaf of bread, and she cried the whole way quietly while Pebble trotted ahead and occasionally looked back at her with concern. The first month was harder than she would later be able to describe. Her hands blistered, then bled, then calloused. She learned to split kindling. She learned to bank a stove fire so it would still be alive in the morning. She learned that the hand pump had to be primed with a cup of water in cold weather. She learned that the privy out back was not, in fact, a privy, but a composting toilet her grandmother had built in 1979, that with a little instruction from Alistair Quimby, it still worked. She slept in her grandmother's bed under 3 quilts. She woke in the dark, hearing the cove move against the rocks, and on the 7th night, she realized that she had not, in 35 years of marriage, slept a single night in a room where she could hear the sea. Garrett called once. It was the second week. She was outside hauling water from the well house when her phone rang in her coat pocket. She answered without looking at the screen, which she would not have done if she had. Ellie, he said, where are you? You know where I am. You're not actually staying there. I'm actually staying here, he laughed. It was a thin, sharp sound, the sound he made when he was about to say something he believed was clever. Ellie, sweetheart, you'll be back by Christmas. You can't even change a light bulb. She set the bucket down on the frozen ground. She watched her breath in the air. She thought very briefly and very clearly of every dinner she had cooked for him in the past 35 years, every shirt she had ironed, every time he had told her she was overreacting, every time he had told her in the careful voice of a man explaining a difficult subject to a slow child that she did not understand the world the way he did. Garrett, she said, I split 20 pounds of kindling this morning. I'll be back when the cove freezes solid, which it hasn't done since 1934. Don't call me again. She hung up. She stood for a minute in the cold, looking at the patched window of her grandmother's cottage. Then she picked up the bucket and went back to work. The discovery began, though she did not know it yet, in the 5th week. She had been avoiding her grandmother's bedroom. The other rooms felt neutral, almost public. The parlor, the kitchen, the back pantry. But the bedroom was where Cordelia had slept and woken and dressed and undressed for 50 years, and walking into it felt like walking into a confession. Eloise had kept the door closed and slept those first weeks on the horsehair sofa in the parlor with Pebble curled at her feet. It was a Tuesday. The wind was high. The cove below the cliff was the color of slate. Eloise had finished her morning chores, and the cottage was clean, and there was nothing left to do except face the bedroom or face another long afternoon of pretending she had something else to do. She opened the door. The room smelled of cedar and old wool. The iron bed was made. A nightgown hung from a hook on the back of the door. On the dresser was a hairbrush with a few long white hairs, still tangled in the bristles. A small frame photograph of a man Eloise recognized as her grandfather. A chipped saucer with 3 sea-smooth pebbles in it. Eloise sat down on the bed and put her face in her hands. She cried for a long time. She cried for her grandmother who had died alone in this room in 1998 while Eloise was at a gala in Connecticut. She cried for the 26 years she had let this cottage sit empty because Garrett had said, "What would we do with a shack in Maine?" She cried for the woman she had been at 36, who had believed her husband when he told her that her grandmother's life had been small. Pebble climbed up onto the bed and pressed his side against her thigh. When she could move again, she stood up. She opened the top drawer of the dresser. Inside, beneath a folded shawl, was a small leather book. It was not one of the 11 journals she would find later under the floorboard. It was something else. It was thinner. It was newer. The leather was cracked but soft. There was no title on the cover. Eloise lifted it out. She opened to the first page. The handwriting was her grandmother's. The date at the top was the 7th of October, 1996. My dear Eloise, if you are reading this, then I have died, and you have come here at last. I have been waiting for you to come for a long time. I am sorry for the things I am about to tell you. I am sorry that I have not had the courage to say them while I am still alive. I have watched you, child, across the years. I have watched you marry a man I do not trust. I have watched you grow quieter and quieter at family suppers. I have watched the light go out of your face, one small lamp at a time, the way a house goes dark room by room when the storm comes in. Garrett has the eyes of a man who has borrowed his wife. I knew it the day you brought him here, the summer of 1989. I did not say so. I should have. I have been a coward, my Ellie, and that is the great regret of my life. I am writing this in the autumn of my 65th year. I do not know how many years are left to me, but I have done a thing in this house that I want you to know about. I have prepared something. I have hidden it under the floor of this room, beneath the 3rd board from the wall. It is a thing I made over the course of 40 years, and it has no value to anyone in the world except perhaps to you. I have prepared it because I believe in my bones that one day you will come up that road with nothing left, and you will need a thing that is only yours. Take care of the cottage. Take care of the cove. Your grandmother, Cordelia Thornberry of Wren Haven Bluff, October 1996. Eloise sat on the edge of the bed with the letter in her lap. She did not move. The wind pulled at the patch window. Pebble pressed his small warm side against her thigh, and somewhere underneath the grief and underneath the long, slow burn of 35 years of being made smaller, something in Eloise Thornberry sat up. She looked at the floor. She counted the boards from the wall. 1, 2, 3. The 3rd board from the wall in the lamplight looked exactly like the others, but when she knelt down and ran her hand along its seam, she felt that the nails had been pulled and replaced very neatly with 2 small wooden pegs. Outside, the cove moved against the rocks. Eloise stayed on her knees on the cold pine floor with her grandmother's letter in one hand and her other hand resting on the loose board. And for the first time since the morning Garrett had walked into her kitchen with 2 strangers and a leather portfolio, she felt something rise inside her that she had almost forgotten the shape of. It was not hope. It was older than hope. It was the small, stubborn animal feeling of a woman who has just realized that she is not after all alone in the dark. She did not lift the board yet. She did not lift it that night. She folded her grandmother's letter very carefully. She put it back in the drawer. She covered the loose floorboard with the small braided rug at the foot of the bed. She walked out of the bedroom and closed the door behind her. the way a person closes the door on a gift she is not yet ready to open. She made herself supper on the cast iron stove. She ate it slowly at her grandmother's table, with Pebble at her feet. Outside, the wind came up, the cove kept moving, and somewhere in the dark on the granite bluff, in a cottage built by a woman who had not lived long enough to see her granddaughter come home a thing that had been waiting for 26 years under a pine floorboard, waited a little longer. She did not lift the board for 3 more days. She told herself it was because the wind was bad and the stove needed banking twice a night now that November had come and the wood pile behind the cottage was lower than it ought to be. She told herself it was because she wanted to be ready. She told herself a great many things across those 3 days, and she carried each one of them with her down to the cove in the morning and back up the cliff stairs at dusk. And she knew with the small private honesty a woman comes into late in her life that none of them were true. She had not lifted the board because she was afraid. She was afraid that under the floorboard there would be nothing at all. She was afraid her grandmother in the autumn of her 65th year had written a letter to a granddaughter she loved and then lost her nerve, the way Eloise herself had lost her nerve 1,000 times in 35 years. She was afraid that whatever Cordelia had hidden would turn out to be the small, disappointed kind of thing, a string of pearls, a savings bond, a folded napkin with a recipe on it that would mean somehow that the great gentle promise of the letter had been a lie. And she was afraid more than anything of the other thing. She was afraid it would not be a disappointment. She was afraid it would be real. On the 3rd morning, a Tuesday in the 2nd week of November, the wind came in off the cove at 4 o'clock and rattled the patched window so hard that Pebble climbed off the horsehair sofa and pressed himself against her knee, trembling. She got up. She lit the lamp. She walked into the kitchen and made coffee on the cast iron stove, the way her grandmother had made coffee, on this same stove for 50 years, and she drank the first cup, standing at the soapstone sink, with her hand flat on the cold counter, looking out at the dark. The dawn came slow. The cove went gray, then pewter, then the soft, luminous gray of an oyster shell turned to catch the light. Eloise set the cup down. She walked into her grandmother's bedroom. She did not turn on the lamp. The morning was enough. She pulled back the small braided rug at the foot of the iron bed. She looked at the 3rd floorboard from the wall. She knelt. She had a butter knife in her hand. She did not remember picking it up. She worked the blade into the seam. The board came up easier than she expected. The wooden pegs slid out clean. The board lifted in her hands like something that had been waiting to be lifted, and underneath it, in the dim, cold space between the joists, sat a cedar chest. It was small, no bigger than a bread box. The corners were dovetailed by hand. The brass hinges had gone black with age. There was no lock. Eloise lifted the chest out with both hands. It was heavier than she had expected, heavier than a bread box should have been. She set it on the bare floor at the foot of the bed, and she sat down cross-legged in front of it, the way she had sat in front of presents, as a child in a different house, in a different century, when her grandmother had been alive and the world had still been a place where she could be surprised. She lifted the lid. The smell came out first, cedar and oil and something faintly mineral, the smell of paper that has been kept dry for a long time by a woman who knew how to keep things dry. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were books. Eloise lifted the top one out. It was a leather-bound journal, perhaps 8 inches by 10. The leather had cracked and softened with age, but the binding was still tight. The pages, when she opened it on her lap, did not crackle. They turned the way good paper turns. They turned the way a thing that has been loved turns. The first page held a watercolor. It was a tide pool. It was painted with such precise, patient detail that Eloise, who had spent 4 years of her life in graduate seminars on Dutch still life painting, understood within 15 seconds that she was looking at the work of a person who had spent thousands of hours with her face 6 inches from a tide pool. The water itself was rendered in 7 different shades of green. The light fell across the surface in the particular slant of late afternoon. There was a green crab in the lower left corner. There were 2 limpets clinging to a stone. There were half hidden under a frond of seaweed the small pale spines of a sea urchin. Eloise did not at first see, and then could not unsee. Underneath the painting, in her grandmother's small, even hand, was the date, April 17th, 1957. Wrenhaven Bluff, North Cove, low water at 6:42 a.m., water 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Eloise turned the page. A second tide pool, a different one, painted 3 weeks later. The same crab, or perhaps a brother, Cordelia had written in the margin. They look so alike, I cannot be sure, in a slightly different position. The same careful temperature notes, the same patient cataloging. She turned the page. A pencil study of a single anemone in 12 small panels across the spread of 2 pages, showing the anemone opening over the course of a tide, each panel labeled with a time, each panel labeled with a description: tentacles half extended, tentacles fully extended, tentacles withdrawing. Beneath the 12 panels in fine block letters, Anthopleura elegantissima, confirmed by Dr. Halberstam, University of Maine, by letter August 1958. Eloise closed the journal. She did not know in the moment why she closed it. Later, walking down the cliff stairs to the cove with Pebble at her heels, she would understand that she had closed it because she had needed very badly to be alone with what she had just seen for 1 minute before she let it become real. She sat on the floor in her grandmother's bedroom for perhaps half a minute with the closed journal on her lap and her hand flat on its cover. Then she opened it again. She lifted the next journal out of the chest. There were 11 of them. They went from 1957 to 1996. She knew before she opened the second one what she was looking at. She had known the moment she had seen the tide pool on the first page. She had taken 3 semesters of marine biology as electives in college before she had switched to art history, and she remembered enough to know what a 4-decade visual record of a single stretch of coast was worth. She had married a man who had told her in the kitchen of her own life that this was not a thing her grandmother could have done. The second journal was charts, hand-drawn nautical charts in pen and ink. Sections of coast Eloise did not recognize until she found a small label in the corner of the 3rd page. Wrenhaven Bluff, North Cove, 1971. The charts showed sea caves. They showed reefs. They showed a particular small cove her grandmother had named in fine block letters, Mother Cove, with a note in the margin: seal colony, spring only born 1962, no rookery known elsewhere along this stretch. There were tide tables, there were depth soundings, there were notes about boats that had wrecked along this coast in the 18th and 19th centuries, with sources cited in the margins by name: Per, Hollingsworth, Lobsterman in conversation, July 1968. Per Tarbox, retired Coast Guard, in conversation, October 1972. The 3rd journal was specimens, not pressed exactly. Pressed seaweed lay between sheets of wax paper, each piece labeled with a Latin name and a date and a location. Eloise recognized some of the Latin from a long-ago college class. She did not recognize most of it. The 4th journal opened with a single page on which her grandmother had written in the careful, unhurried script of a woman who had thought about this sentence for a long time before she wrote it down. I begin this book in the spring of 1972, in the 15th year of my study. I have decided to keep what I observe whether anyone reads it or not. I have decided this is enough. Eloise stopped breathing for a moment. She set the journal down. She put both hands flat on the floor on either side of her, and she breathed very slowly until her chest remembered how. Pebble had come into the room without her noticing. He was sitting on the small braided rug she had pulled back from the floorboard. He was watching her with his ears tilted slightly forward, the way he watched her when she was crying, although she was not crying yet. At the bottom of the chest beneath the journals were 6 glass jars sealed with wax. Each jar held shells. Each jar was labeled. The labels said things like Atlantic Surf Clam, North Cove, 1963, Atlantic Surf Clam, North Cove, 1989. The contents of the 1963 jar were noticeably larger, and at the very bottom, beneath everything else folded once, was a letter. The letter was addressed in her grandmother's handwriting to whoever finds this and loves the sea. Eloise held it for a long time before she opened it. When she did, she read it twice, slowly. If you are reading this, then I am dead, and I am sorry I did not have the courage to give this work to anyone while I was alive. I began the study in the spring of 1957 when I was 26. I kept it for 40 years because no one would take an old fisherman's wife seriously, and I was tired of being laughed at. I did not have the schooling. I did not have the letters after my name, but I knew this coast. I knew the tide pools and the caves and the seasons of every creature that moves through this water, and I wrote it down because I could see that it was disappearing, and I could not bear for it to disappear without anyone having loved it. Some of what I have drawn here cannot be found anymore. I have watched species leave this coast in my lifetime. I have watched coves seal up. I have watched reefs go dead. I have watched the seal colony in Mother Cove dwindle from 48 head in 1962 to 4 head in the spring of 1995. I do not know if 4 will be enough. If anything in these books is useful to a person who knows what to do with it, please give it to that person. If no one finds this, that is all right too. I made it because it needed to be made. Take care of the cottage. Take care of the cove. Your grandmother, Cordelia Thornberry of Wren Haven Bluff, November 1996. Eloise sat on the bare floor of her grandmother's bedroom with the letter in her lap and Pebble pressed against her side, and she did not cry. She sat very still with the wind pulling at the patched window, and she felt the entire shape of her life rearrange itself. She thought, I have something to do. For the first time since the morning Garrett had walked into her kitchen with 2 strangers, she thought it without flinching. She did not tell anyone about the chest for almost 2 weeks. She read the journals first, all 11 of them, in order, sitting at the kitchen table with the wood stove going and Pebble asleep on her feet and a pencil in her hand. She had not held a pencil that way in 40 years. Her hand remembered before her mind did. Her grandmother had begun the work in the spring of 1957. Cordelia had been 26. She had married Eloise's grandfather in 1955, the year she built the cottage. She had walked the tide pools at low water with a sketchbook and a tin box of watercolors and a copy of a marine biology textbook borrowed from the Wren Haven Bluff Library, a textbook Eloise would later find on the parlor shelf with Cordelia's pencil notes in nearly every margin. She had taught herself the Latin. She had taught herself the cell structure of the species she could not name. She had written letters by hand to a marine biologist at the University of Maine in 1962 asking for help identifying a particular kind of sea slug, and she had kept his polite dismissive reply folded inside the journal where the slug was painted. Eloise read the dismissive reply twice. Dear Mrs. Thornberry, thank you for your inquiry. The species you describe is unfamiliar to me, and I am afraid I do not have time at present to identify it from your sketch. May I suggest that you contact your local high school biology teacher who may be able to assist a curious amateur. With best regards. She read it a 3rd time. She thought of Garrett's voice in the kitchen, 35 years of it, layered like sediment. She thought of every dinner party where she had been seated next to a man who had asked her on being told she had a master's degree in art history. Oh, and is that something you do anymore? Or just a hobby now? She felt something old and sharp rise in her chest. She turned the page. The journals showed 40 years. The watercolors got better. The notes got more precise. By the late 70s, Cordelia had begun marking species she had not seen for several seasons in a row with small, careful question marks beside their names. By the late 80s, those question marks had become, in some cases, the word gone in her grandmother's small, even hand. Eloise read all 11. She closed the last journal on a Sunday afternoon. The wind had dropped. The cove was the color of beaten tin. She walked outside in her grandmother's coat and stood at the cliff edge for a long time looking down at the water with pebble pressed against her boot. Then she walked back inside and she put the chest in a canvas tote bag her grandmother had used for groceries, and she walked down the dirt road and through the village to the small library next to the post office. She had decided sitting on the kitchen floor that morning that she was going to do exactly one thing. She was going to find a person who knew what she was looking at. The library was open 4 days a week. The librarian was a tall man in his late 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and a careful, observant face. His name was Linus Ashby. He had moved to Wren Haven Bluff from Boston 4 years ago. Myron Voss had told Eloise this in the bakery one morning, and the village had not entirely decided what to make of him yet, but he was the only person in town with a master's degree in anything. Eloise had been into the library twice before for books, and they had nodded politely at each other across the counter, and she had decided, walking through the village that morning with the chest in the canvas tote, that he was the person to talk to. The library was warm. There was a small ceramic heater on the floor. A black cat was asleep on the rolling cart of returned books. Linus Ashby looked up from his computer when she came in, and Eloise crossed the small room and set the canvas tote on the counter and lifted out the first journal. She opened it to the painting of the hermit crab in panel 12, late afternoon, June 1968. The hermit crab was halfway out of its shell. She turned the book around so it faced him. She did not speak. Linus Ashby looked at the page. He looked at it for a long time. He took off his glasses. He put them back on. He looked at it again. Eloise watched the small, careful change happen in his face. She watched the librarian's face become the face of a man who has just understood that a thing he assumed was an ordinary morning has stopped being ordinary. He picked up the journal with both hands the way a person picks up something he is afraid to drop. He turned the pages. Slowly, he came to the chart of Mother Cove. He stopped. "Mrs. Thornberry," he said quietly, "where did you get this?" "My grandmother made it." "When?" "Between 1957 and 1996. Linus Ashby sat down on the stool behind the counter. He took his glasses off again. He set them down on the page. He looked up at her. "Mrs. Thornberry," he said, "there is a marine biologist at Bowdoin. Her name is Dr. Coraline Whitfield. She has been working for the past 8 years on a project documenting the historical biodiversity of this stretch of coast. She has been searching specifically for any private records made by local people before 1980, because the institutional records do not exist. Last year, she gave a public lecture at this library. I attended. I asked her after if she had ever found anything. She said no. She said it was probably too late. She said the women who would have kept records like that were dead now and their families had thrown the records out. He looked down at the journal again. He swallowed. "Mrs. Thornberry, may I call her?" "Yes," Eloise said. "Today?" "Yes." Dr. Coraline Whitfield drove up from Brunswick 3 days later. She came in a mud-spattered field truck with a Bowdoin College parking permit fading on the windshield. She was perhaps 40. She had cropped iron gray hair and weathered hands and the alert, calm manner of a woman who had spent a great deal of her life waiting for tides. She wore a green canvas jacket. She brought a folding magnifier and a roll of acid-free paper and a notebook, and nothing else. And when she walked into the parlor of Driftwood Hollow Cottage and Eloise put the kettle on, Dr. Whitfield did not speak. She set her bag down on the horsehair sofa. She crossed to the kitchen table where Eloise had laid out the chest. She sat down. She lifted the first journal. She turned the first page. She turned the second. She did not speak for almost 20 minutes. When she did, her voice was unsteady. "Mrs. Thornberry." "Yes." "Your grandmother documented at least 4 species along this coast that are now considered locally extirpated. She painted them from life. She gave us water temperatures. She gave us exact locations. She gave us tide phases. She gave us 40 years of continuous observation in a place where we have nothing." Dr. Whitfield looked up. Her eyes were wet. She did not seem to know it. "Do you understand what this is?" Eloise stood at the soapstone sink with her hand around the kettle. "Yes," she said, "I think I do." Dr. Whitfield stayed 2 days. She slept on the horsehair sofa with Pebble curled against the back of her knees. She drank Eloise's coffee. She ate a great deal of Marin Voss's bread. On the second morning at first light, she and Eloise walked down the cliff stairs at low water in the cold, gray wind with one of Cordelia's hand-drawn charts in Eloise's mittened hands. They walked half a mile north along the rocks. They found exactly where the chart said it would be the small mouth of a sea cave Eloise herself had only located 3 weeks before. Dr. Whitfield climbed inside in her tall rubber boots. She came out 20 minutes later. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "It's still here. 2 of the species are still in there, Eloise. They are still in there." It was the first time anyone had called her Eloise in 11 weeks. She did not cry on the rocks. She did not cry, in fact, until she was back inside the cottage, and Dr. Whitfield was upstairs writing in her notebook, and Pebble had climbed onto her lap, and the wind was pulling at the patch window, the way it had been pulling at the window since October, and Eloise sat at her grandmother's kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee in her hand, and she thought for the first time, "Grandmother, you did not waste it. None of it. None of it was wasted." She cried then for a long time. Pebble pressed his small white head against her collarbone and waited. The thing that happened next happened so quickly that years afterward, when she tried to tell people about it, Eloise would always pause and shake her head at how fast it had moved. Wren Holloway was 20 years old. She was Marin Voss's niece, a freshman at the University of Maine, home for a long weekend at the end of November. She had been working mornings at Driftwood Hollow for 2 weeks on Eloise's 3rd week in the cottage after Marin had introduced them at the bakery. "She'll watch the dog. She'll help you carry firewood. You pay her in cash. She is saving for a winter coat." Wren was small, quick-freckled with a dark braid down her back, and she carried her phone in her back pocket, the way Eloise's father had once carried a pocket watch. On the second day of Dr. Whitfield's visit, Wren had come up the dirt road in the early afternoon to bring a tray of Marin cinnamon rolls. She had stood in the parlor doorway with the tray in her hands while Dr. Whitfield, at the kitchen table, was photographing a page of one of the journals with a small black camera on a tripod. The page showed the hermit crab, June 1968, 12 panels. Wren had looked at the painting. She had looked at Eloise. She had looked back at the painting. "Mrs. Thornberry," she had said, Could I film something for my account?" Eloise, who did not understand social media and who had at that moment been entirely occupied with the question of whether there would be enough firewood to get her through December, had said yes. She had said yes because it had seemed harmless. What Wren did was this. She walked down the cliff stairs at the next low tide with one of Cordelia's journals open in her hands. She held the camera on her phone in a particular way that Eloise did not understand. She crouched at the edge of a tide pool whose location and water temperature and tidal phase were marked on a chart in the journal she was holding. and she opened the journal to the painting of the hermit crab. She filmed the painting. She moved the phone slowly down from the painting, and she panned across the rocks, and she came to rest the camera on a hermit crab, a real one, a small living hermit crab moving sideways across the wet sand of the same tide pool 60 years later, with the same five-pointed pattern of white speckles on its shell that the watercolor showed. The video was 38 seconds long. She posted it on a Sunday evening. The caption read, "My neighbor's grandmother painted this in 1968. She just found the journals." By Tuesday morning, the video had been viewed 4 million times. By Tuesday afternoon, 3 news outlets had emailed Linus Ashby at the library asking for Eloise's contact information. By Tuesday evening, the post office on the village street had received 17 letters addressed to the granddaughter Driftwood, Hollow Cottage, Wrenhaven Bluff, Maine. The postmaster, a man named Bart Whitaker, walked them up the dirt road himself in 2 heavy canvas bags. He set them on the porch. He looked at Eloise for a long moment. He said, "Cordelia would have liked this." He touched the brim of his cap and walked back down the road into the falling dusk. By Friday, a reporter from the Portland Press-Herald was standing on her porch. Eloise put on the kettle. The reporter's name was Marlo Sterling. She was perhaps 35, in a heavy wool coat, the color of oatmeal, with sensible boots and a leather messenger bag, and the alert, slightly tired look of a woman who had driven 3 hours that morning, expecting one story, and was now beginning to realize she had walked into a different one. Her hair was dark and pinned up. She had a small notebook in her coat pocket, and she did not take it out. She did not turn on a recorder. She sat at Eloise's grandmother's kitchen table. She accepted a cup of coffee with cream. Pebble climbed into her lap without being invited. Marlo Sterling scratched his ears absently and watched Eloise the way a person watches a bird that has landed close. "Mrs. Thornberry," she said. "Yes. I don't want to write the divorce story." Eloise set the cream pitcher down on the table. "I beg your pardon." Marlo Sterling took a slow breath. She looked at her coffee cup. She looked up. "My editor sent me up here because the video went viral and because someone in the comments section figured out fairly quickly that you are the wife of Garrett Halloran. The Halloran Fund is in some difficulty in certain circles in Connecticut at the moment. The divorce is semi-public. My editor wants the divorce angle, the smirking husband, the forgotten cottage, the deed in the glove compartment." Marlo Sterling held Eloise's eyes. "I drove up here today to tell you in person that I am not going to write that story. I want to write the story your grandmother left in those journals, if you'll let me." Eloise looked at her for a long time. She looked at the small notebook bulging in the woman's coat pocket. She looked at the way Pebble had settled into Marlo Sterling's lap with the trustful weight of a dog who has decided something about a person before the person has finished her sentence. She looked at the wool coat. She looked at the woman's hands. "What is your name again?" she said. "Marlo." "Marlo Sterling." "Marlo." Eloise sat down across from her. "Drink your coffee. We'll walk down to the cove." The piece Marlo Sterling wrote ran in the Sunday edition 10 days later. It was 3,000 words long. It was not in any meaningful sense about Garrett. He appeared by name in exactly one paragraph near the end as the granddaughter's ex-husband who described the property as worthless in the proceedings. The rest of the piece was about a woman named Cordelia Thornberry, who had taught herself marine biology in a kitchen by a cove because no one else would do it, and about her granddaughter who had inherited 11 journals in a cottage with a leaking roof, and about the part of the Maine coast that had been quietly disappearing while no one was looking. The headline read, "What Cordelia Thornberry Knew." It was picked up that Tuesday by the New York Times and the Boston Globe. It was picked up by an environmental magazine in Vermont. It was picked up by the public radio station in Portland, which sent a reporter and a microphone up the dirt road on a Thursday morning in the first week of December. Ren Holloway's video account, which had had 400 followers in October, had 320,000 followers. By the second Friday of December, Maren Voss began handing out small printouts of the bakery's address at the cash register to women who asked with shy, hopeful faces whether there were any rooms to rent in the village. Eloise sat at her grandmother's kitchen table. She watched it happen. She did not, and this was the thing she could not quite explain to herself. Even later, she did not feel surprise. She felt something closer to a long, slow recognition, the way a person feels when she finally finds, after years of carrying it around in her pocket, the door that fits the key she has been holding. The first stranger came up the dirt road on a Saturday morning. She was a retired school teacher from a town 40 minutes inland. Her name was Philippa Bloomfield. Everyone called her Pippa. She was 70 years old, square-shouldered, white-haired, and she came up the dirt road in a green station wagon with a casserole on the passenger seat and a cardigan she had knitted herself and a tortoiseshell hair comb pinning back her hair. She set the casserole on the porch without comment. She knocked. When Eloise opened the door, Philippa Bloomfield said, "I read the piece in the Press Herald. I taught fourth grade science for 41 years. I retired in June. My husband died in August. I have been losing my mind in my own kitchen for 3 months. Tell me what you need." Eloise looked at her. She looked at the casserole. She looked at the green station wagon. She looked at the woman's hands, which were red from the cold, and the steering wheel. "Are you any good with a broom?" Eloise said. "I am better with a broom than I am with anything else in this world." "Come in," Eloise said. The second was Rosalind Vance. Rosalind Vance was 68, the widow of a fisherman who had not come home from a December run in 2011. She had not, by her own admission, done much of anything since. She came down the dirt road on a Tuesday in a pickup truck older than her marriage, with a cake on the passenger seat and her dead husband's tackle box on the floor. She did not say much. She set the cake on the kitchen table. She helped Eloise carry firewood for 2 hours. She drove home. She came back on Thursday. She came back on Sunday. By the second week of December, she was at the cottage 4 days out of 7. She had brought her dead husband's tools. She had set them out on a clean cloth on the back porch. She had, without being asked, repaired the sagging porch step on the left side and replaced 2 of the rotten boards in the floor of the back pantry. She did not speak about her husband. Pippa Bloomfield, who had a fourth-grade teacher's instinct for the particular weight of silence in another woman's body, did not ask her to. The third was Octavia Penrose. Octavia Penrose was 66 and had been a nurse for 38 years. She arrived on a Friday in a small red car with a first aid kit, a thermos of soup, and the firm conviction that Eloise, who was working 10 hours a day in November weather, was going to break a hip if someone did not start watching her. She was, Eloise realized within the first hour of meeting her, exactly correct. Octavia Penrose announced before she had finished her first cup of coffee that Eloise would be sitting down for 10 minutes every 2 hours, drinking a glass of water every hour and eating something with protein in it at every meal, and that this was non-negotiable, and that Octavia would be at the cottage Tuesdays and Fridays to make sure of it. Eloise, who had not been told what to do by another woman since her own mother had died in 1989, looked at Octavia Penrose for a long moment and said, "Yes, ma'am." The fourth was Isolde Marchetti. Isolde Marchetti was 64. She was very thin and very quiet, and she wore her gray hair in a single long braid down her back the way Maren Voss wore hers, although the two women had not yet met. She was a painter. She had read Marlowe Sterling's article in the Press Herald, and she had then spent 2 days looking at the scans of Cordelia's watercolors that someone at Bowdoin had begun posting online and she had driven up to Wrenhaven Bluff, alone on a gray Wednesday afternoon, and walked into the cottage and said, "I would like to help catalog the paintings. I will not charge you. I have nothing else to do." Eloise looked at her. She looked at the thin woman in the gray coat and the long braid. She looked at the woman's hands, which were stained very faintly with the particular blue that Eloise recognized from a long time ago as cobalt. "You're a painter." "I was. I have not painted in 6 years. My husband—" Isolde Marchetti paused. She looked down at her hands. "It does not matter. I would like to help catalog the paintings." "All right," Eloise said. The four of them, Pippa Bloomfield and Rosalind Vance and Octavia Penrose and Isolde Marchetti, became across the second half of December and the first weeks of January, something Eloise had not had a word for since she was a girl. Garrett had not let her have close friendships. He had not said so in those words. He had said her friends were catty or needy or a bad influence. He had said when she came home from a lunch with a college roommate, "You always come back from her so wound up." He had said when a neighbor invited her on a women's weekend in Vermont, "Of course, go if you want, sweetheart, but it does seem expensive for what it is." She had let those friendships go one by one across 35 years, the way a person lets keys slip out of a coat pocket without noticing. Now there were 4 women in her grandmother's cottage. They argued about the right way to organize the journals. They cooked enormous meals on the wood stove. Octavia made Eloise sit down every 2 hours. Pippa labeled every specimen jar in her teacher's handwriting. Isolde sat for whole afternoons by the window with a magnifying glass and a soft pencil copying Cordelia's brushstrokes in order to understand them. Rosalind repaired the porch. Rosalind, in fact, would 2 weeks later climb up onto the roof in her dead husband's boots with a hammer in her belt loop and replace 3 of the worst shingles before Octavia Penrose, who had come up the dirt road that morning, looked up from the driveway and shouted, "Rosalind Vance, you get down off that roof this minute or so, help me." And Rosalind had laughed for the first time since 2011. Eloise heard the laugh from inside the cottage. She heard the laugh from her grandmother's kitchen, where she was making tea with Pebble at her feet, and she set the kettle down on the cast iron stove, and she stood very still, and she listened to the sound of a woman laughing on the roof of a house Eloise's grandmother had built. She thought of Garrett's voice in the kitchen in Greenwich. "You can't even change a light bulb." She thought of her grandmother's letter. "Garrett has the eyes of a man who has borrowed his wife." She walked outside onto the porch. The wind was sharp. The cove was the color of pewter. Rosalind was coming down the ladder, her face flushed, her gray braids sticking out from under a watch cap. Octavia was holding the bottom of the ladder with both hands and shaking her head and trying not to smile. Pippa was on the porch with her arms full of firewood. Isolde was standing at the corner of the cottage with her sketchbook drawing the way the light fell on the silver shingles. Pebble trotted out onto the porch and pressed against Eloise's leg. She put her hand down and touched his small, warm head. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She stood on the porch of a cottage her grandmother had built with her own hands in 1955, and she watched 4 women, none of whom she had known 6 weeks ago, fix her roof and label her jars and draw her light, and she thought very quietly, "Grandmother." They came. The letter arrived on a Friday. It came in a heavy cream envelope with the Bowdoin College seal in the upper left corner. Linus Ashby brought it up the dirt road himself on his lunch break because he had recognized the return address. He stood on the porch and waited while Eloise opened it. The letter was from Dr. Coraline Whitfield. It was 3 pages long. It explained that the college had reviewed the preliminary digital scans of the journals, that the marine biology department wished to formally establish a collaboration with Driftwood Hollow Cottage, that there was a small grant available for the immediate purpose of stabilizing the structure of the cottage, including a new roof, and that a graduate student named Mayon, who had spent the last 4 years studying historical biodiversity records along the New England coast, had wept openly in Dr. Whitfield's office on first being shown the painting of the hermit crab. Eloise read the letter twice. She handed it to Linus Ashby. He read it. He looked up. "Mrs. Thornberry," he said. "Eloise, Eloise." He smiled very carefully, the way a quiet man smiles when he has been given permission to smile at something. "I believe you are about to have a project." She looked at him. She looked past him down the dirt road. The wind was lifting the dry spruce branches. A small flock of chickadees was working through a tangle of bayberry by the gate. Down at the cottage behind her, she could hear the 4 women arguing gently about whether the second journal should be cataloged by date or by location. Pebble was sitting on the porch behind her, watching a squirrel he was no longer young enough to chase. She thought of the kitchen in Greenwich. She thought of the smirk. She thought of a man who had told her in October that she could not change a light bulb. She turned back to Linus Ashby. The wind moved her hair. "Yes," she said, "I believe I am." She did not know in that moment that within 4 months, Garrett Halloran's hedge fund would collapse. She did not know that within 6 months, Sloan Beaufort would leave him. She did not know that within 9 months, a small gray rental car would come up the dirt road in the late afternoon of a March day, and that the man who got out of it would not be the man she had married. She did not know any of it. She only knew the wind off the cove, and the dog at her ankle, and the letter in the librarian's hand, and the women in the kitchen of a house her grandmother had built. It was enough. She turned and walked back into the cottage, and she closed the door behind her against the cold, and somewhere in the kitchen, Pippa Bloomfield was laughing about something, and Octavia Penrose was opening a jar of preserves Cordelia Thornberry had sealed in 1994, and the wood stove was burning, and the light through the patched window was the color of old butter, and Eloise Thornberry was home. The winter that followed was the hardest of her life and the best. The cold came down on Wrenhaven Bluff the second week of December and did not lift for 91 days. The cove froze at the edges the way it had not frozen since 1979, and the lobster boats that still went out wrapped in ice. The dirt road glazed over in the morning and softened to mud by afternoon and refroze by dark, and Eloise learned the way a woman of 62 learns the things her body has not asked of it in 40 years, how to walk on a road like that without breaking a hip. Octavia Penrose drove up twice a week with a thermos of soup and a bag of cleats that strapped onto Eloise's boots. Pippa Bloomfield came on Thursdays and stayed through the weekend, sleeping on a cot in the back pantry that Rosalind Vance had built from a barn door and 4 sawhorses. Isolde Marchetti rented a small room above Purnell's bakery for the season and came up the dirt road every morning with a thermos of tea and a fresh sheet of acid-free paper folded into her satchel. Rosalind herself moved a cot into the parlor in January and stopped pretending she was going home at night. The roof was finished by the 3rd week of December. The Bowden grant paid for it. Alistair Quimby, who was 71 years old and bowed in the shoulders and stiff in the knees, climbed up onto the rafters in his patched wool sweater and supervised the 2 men from the next county over with the patient, implacable authority of a man who had been nailing shingles in this wind since 1962. "City boys," he muttered more than once in Eloise's hearing. "They do not know how to set a nail in this wind." On the 2nd day of the work, he came down off the ladder for lunch, and Pippa Bloomfield set a bowl of stew in front of him at the kitchen table, and he ate it without taking off his cap. And when he had finished, he looked at Eloise across the table and said very quietly, "Your grandmother would be proud." Eloise did not answer. She did not trust her voice. She nodded once. Alistair Quimby nodded back. He went out and climbed back up the ladder. The cottage filled that winter with the kind of life it had not held since 1996. The kitchen was warm and loud. The wood stove burned day and night. Pippa Bloomfield made a chart in her school teacher's hand of every species Cordelia had documented across 40 years, color-coded by status green for still present yellow, for not recently observed, red for gone. The chart hung on the parlor wall above the fireplace, and Eloise saw the red and her chest tightened every time, and she made herself look at it anyway, because her grandmother had looked at it for 40 years and not flinched, and she would not flinch now. The mail kept coming. Bart Whitaker, the postmaster, walked the heavy canvas sacks up the dirt road twice a week, and Eloise sat at her grandmother's kitchen table with Pebble at her feet and read every letter by hand by lamplight. Most were short. Most were from women. A woman in Maryland who had inherited her own grandmother's bird journals and not known what to do with them, and had thrown them out in 1991 in a moment she now thought about every day. A woman in Oregon whose mother had kept tide tables for 60 years for a stretch of Pacific coast that was now a parking lot. A woman in Vermont who simply wrote on a single piece of stationery, "I am 81 years old. I read about your grandmother. Thank you for not letting them throw her out." Eloise read that one twice. She folded it. She put it in the drawer of the kitchen table where her grandmother had kept the matches. The donations began arriving in the second week of December, small checks mostly. $20, $40. A woman in Iowa sent $150 folded into a Christmas card. Pippa Bloomfield, who had been the unofficial treasurer of her own school's PTA for 30 years, set up a small folding table in the parlor and a green ledger book, and she logged every check by hand, and she wrote a thank you note in return in her school teacher's hand to every single person who sent one. By the end of January, the green ledger held the names of 417 women and 11 men. By the second week of February, the Driftwood Hollow Marine Heritage Project was a registered Maine nonprofit. Linus Ashby filed the paperwork. He did not ask to be paid. Dr. Coraline Whitfield came up from Brunswick in the third week of January with 2 graduate students and a portable scanner, and they began formally to digitize the journals. The young woman named May-Ann, whom Dr. Whitfield had mentioned in the letter, turned out to be 26 years old, the daughter of 2 academics, the kind of careful, patient, quiet person whom Eloise recognized almost immediately as the same kind of person her grandmother had been at 26. May-Ann did not speak much. She slept on the cot Rosalind had built in the back pantry. She rose at 5 every morning to scan, and she cataloged the watercolors with the slow, careful joy of a person who had spent her entire adult life looking for a thing she had not been sure was real. On the 7th day of the scanning, May-Ann came out of the back pantry with a journal open in her hands and her face very pale. She crossed the kitchen to Eloise. She set the journal down on the table. "Mrs. Thornberry," she said, "there is something here I would like Dr. Whitfield to see." What May-Ann had found in the margin of a page dated September of 1981 was a small, careful pencil note in Cordelia's hand. "Saw 2 of the small blue today off the rocks at the south end of Mother Cove. Have not seen them since 1968. Will look again tomorrow." And then, in the margin of the page 2 months later, "Saw 4. We'll go back in the spring." May-Ann looked at Eloise. "Mrs. Thornberry, the small blue is a kind of nudibranch. It has been considered locally extinct in this part of the Atlantic since 1971. There has not been a confirmed sighting of it on this coast in 54 years. Your grandmother saw it in 1981, and then again. She thought she had seen it. She wrote it down." Eloise put her hand on the page. The pencil note was very small. Cordelia had written it the way she had written everything in those journals, without flourish, without underlining the careful, unhurried handwriting of a woman who had been told her whole life that her observations did not count, and who had stopped by 1981 expecting them to. "What does it mean?" Eloise said. "It means," said May An, "that I would like to go look for them in May." In May, then. The winter passed. Garrett did not call. He did not write. Eloise's cousin in Hartford called once in the second week of January to say that the Halloran Fund had been put under formal review by the state attorney general's office in December. "Apparently, there is something with the Beaufort girl's father," the cousin had said, with the careful relish of a woman who has been waiting 20 years to deliver a particular piece of news, something about commingled accounts. Eloise had thanked her cousin for calling. She had hung up. She had walked outside onto the porch in her grandmother's coat and stood at the cliff edge for a long time, and she had felt for that long minute nothing at all. She had expected when she heard such news to feel triumph. She had not. She had felt only the cold wind and the smell of salt and the quiet, patient knowledge that her own life had moved at last into a different room. She went back inside. She did not tell the four women about the phone call. She did not see the point. In the second week of February, on a Tuesday evening, Maren Voss came up the dirt road on foot. The light was failing. The wind was sharp. Maren had a brown paper bag in her hand. She climbed the porch steps and knocked, and when Eloise opened the door, Maren Voss looked at her for a long moment. "A man came into the bakery this afternoon," Maren said. "What man?" "A man I have never seen before. He bought a loaf of bread and a coffee. He asked me where the Thornbury place was. I did not tell him." Maren paused. "He had a Connecticut license plate." Eloise stood in the doorway. The wind lifted the dry leaves on the porch. "What did he look like?" she said. Maren Voss considered. "Tall, thin, gray at the temples, wearing a coat that used to be expensive." Eloise nodded once. She did not say anything. Maren Voss looked at her for another long moment. She held out the brown paper bag. Inside the bag was a loaf of yesterday's sourdough and a glass jar of honey. "In case," Maren said. "In case what?" "In case it goes long, sweetheart." Eloise took the bag. Maren Voss touched her shoulder. She turned and walked back down the dirt road into the dusk. Garrett came up the dirt road on the 17th of March. He did not call ahead. He drove up the coast in a rental car because his own car, Eloise would learn later, had been repossessed in February. He came up the dirt road in the late afternoon on a day when the cove was full of broken ice and the wind off the water was the kind of wind that hurt your face if you stood in it too long. Eloise was in the parlor. She and Pippa Bloomfield were going through the latest sack of mail from the post office. Octavia Penrose was in the kitchen with Rosalind Vance making stew. Isolde Marchetti was somewhere outside with her sketchbook, drawing the way the late winter light fell on the silver shingles. Pebble, who had developed strong feelings about visitors, was the first to react. He stood up from his place by the stove. He barked twice, sharp, the way he had not barked since the morning Eloise had loaded the Subaru in October. Eloise looked out the window. The rental car was a small gray sedan. The man getting out of it was not the man she had married. He was thinner. His hair, which had been steel gray in October, had gone almost white at the temples. He stood for a moment in the dirty yard with his hands in his coat pockets, looking up at the cottage. He did not move. He did not knock. He stood and looked at the silver shingles and the new front door and the rose vine that had grown around the porch railing all winter, and Eloise watched him through the patched window and felt with a quiet that surprised her nothing, which surprised her because she had spent some part of every day for 5 months wondering what she would feel if she ever saw him again. She had thought in October that she would feel rage. She had thought in November that she would feel grief. She had thought in December, sitting at the kitchen table reading the letters from women in Maryland and Oregon and Iowa, that she would feel a small, dark joy. She had thought in January, when her cousin called, that she might feel triumph. She felt none of it. She felt only the small, steady weight of her own life sitting now squarely inside her own chest. She turned from the window. "Pippa," she said, "Garrett is here." Pippa Bloomfield set down the stack of envelopes. She looked up. She looked at Eloise for a long moment with the careful, steady eyes of a woman who had spent 41 years reading the faces of fourth graders. "Do you want us to leave?" Pippa said. "No, stay where you are, all of you." Eloise walked out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind her. Garrett stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at her. He had the careful, unsteady expression of a man who had rehearsed a speech in the car and was now in the cold, finding that the speech did not fit his mouth. "Ellie," he said, "don't call me that." He flinched. He nodded. Once. He took a breath. He started again. "Eloise, I know I have no right to be here. I know that. I am not going to ask you for anything." He stopped. He took a breath. He stopped again. The wind came up off the cove and lifted the front of his coat. Eloise watched him. "The fund collapsed in November," he said. "The state attorney general opened the inquiry in December. Sloan left me in January. The house in Greenwich went to the bank in February. I have been staying with my brother in New Haven." He swallowed. "I read the piece in the Press Herald in December. I read the New York Times. I read about your grandmother. I drove up here today to say I am sorry." She watched him. She did not speak. The silence stretched. She let it stretch. She let it go on long enough to feel cruel. She did not care. She had earned this silence over 35 years. She had paid for it in installments she had not known she was making. "That's the speech," she said finally. "That's the speech. Garrett." "Yes. When you walked into my kitchen in October with your lawyer, I asked you one question. I asked you how long. You told me 2 years. She paused. "Was that true?" He looked at his shoes. He stood in the dirty yard with his hands in the pockets of his coat, and he looked at his shoes, and the wind pulled at his thinning hair, and after a long moment, he said in a voice she had never heard out of him in 35 years of marriage, "No." "How long, Garrett?" He did not look up. 6 years. She felt the number drop into her chest. She let it drop. She did not let it show on her face. She had been letting things not show on her face for 35 years, and she discovered very good at it. 6 years, she said. 6 years. Garrett. Yes. 6 years ago is 2018. He did not answer. In 2018, she said, your mother was dying. I drove up to Bridgeport every Tuesday and Thursday and every other Saturday for 18 months. I sat with her. I bathed her. I read to her. I held her hand the week she could no longer speak. I came home late on those nights and you told me you were working. You told me you were sorry you could not be there. You told me that you were grateful to me. You said, Ellie, I do not know what I would do without you. She paused. Was that when it started? He did not answer. Garrett, look at me. He looked up. His eyes were wet. She did not care. Was that when it started? Yes. She did not move. She did not move for a long time. The wind came up off the cove and pulled at the rose vine on the porch railing. Pebble inside the cottage scratched once at the door. She did not turn. She kept her eyes on Garrett Halloran, the man she had married at 27, the man whose mother she had bathed in the last weeks of her life, the man who had walked into her kitchen on a Tuesday in October and made her rinse 4 coffee cups in cold water. Get out of my yard, she said. He flinched. Eloise, please, I did not ask you to explain. I did not ask you to apologize. I did not ask you to come here. Get out of my yard. He stood there. He stood in the dirty yard with the wind on his face, and he did not move. He had nowhere to go, she understood. He had driven up the coast because he had nowhere else in the world to drive to, and the woman on the porch of the cottage he had laughed at 5 months ago in a kitchen in Greenwich was the only person left in his life who had once loved him. She understood this. She did not soften. She came down the porch steps. She stopped in front of him in the dirty yard. He was taller than she was. He had always been taller than her. She had never noticed until this moment how much of her life she had spent looking up at him. "You came up here," she said quietly, "because you have nowhere else to go. You came up here because you read in the New York Times that I had become a person, and you wanted to see if the person I had become would forgive you. The answer is no." He flinched again. "But," she said. He looked up. "I am going to tell you what I tell every person who comes up that road wanting something. You may volunteer. We are out here Saturdays at 6 o'clock in the morning. There is a set of stone steps down the cliff to the cove that has not been cleared of barnacles and ice in 20 years, and we cannot do the spring tide pool surveys until those steps are safe. The work is barnacles. The work is cold water. The work is carrying buckets. You will do it for as long as it takes you to learn what it feels like to build something that is not for yourself. If you do that for one full season, without complaining, without asking for anything, without making it about you, then in October, not before, we will sit on this porch and we will have a conversation." She paused. "That is the only thing I am offering you, Garrett. It is not forgiveness. It is the chance to do one piece of useful work in your life. You can take it, or you can drive back down to New Haven. I do not care which." He stood for a long moment in the dirty yard. The wind moved his thinning hair. "Eloise," he said, "I am 64 years old. I am 63. Rosalind Vance is 68. Alistair Quimby is 71. He did the roof. Make your decision." He stood there. She did not help him. She had spent 35 years helping him make his decisions. She had spent 35 years smoothing the rough edges of his wanting. She had spent 35 years pouring his coffee and straightening his tie and refilling his drink and carrying it back to him across a room, while a younger woman in an emerald green dress had smiled at her and told her she had lovely earrings. She would not help him now. She watched the wind move his hair, and she waited. "Saturday," he said finally, 6 a.m. "Bring gloves," she said. "I will not be providing them." She turned. She walked back up the porch steps. She did not look at him again. Inside, Pippa Bloomfield and Octavia Penrose and Rosalind Vance were standing in the parlor watching her. Isolde Marchetti had come in from the side yard and was standing in the kitchen doorway with her sketchbook still in her hand. Pebble was sitting at attention by the door, his small white head tilted, his black eyes on Eloise's face. Pippa raised one eyebrow. "Stew's almost ready," Rosalind said. "You eating?" Octavia said. "I'm eating," Eloise said. She sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, very faintly, she heard the rental car start up. She heard it back down the dirt road. She heard it disappear into the spruce. She did not turn to watch it go. Rosalind Vance set a bowl of stew in front of her. "Eat," Rosalind said. Eloise ate. 2 years passed. Garrett came every Saturday at 6 o'clock in the morning for the first season. He scraped barnacles off the cliff stairs in November sleet, and in February, ice. He did not complain. Eloise had told him he could not, and Rosalind Vance, who had buried a husband at sea, watched him from the kitchen window with eyes that did not invite complaint. He stayed in a rented room above Purnell's bakery for $16 a night. He learned to bank a stove fire. He learned slowly and against his nature to be quiet around women who were working. The first month he tried twice to engage Pippa Bloomfield in conversation about the weather, and Pippa, who had taught 4th grade for 41 years and who knew exactly how to silence a child who was speaking out of turn, did not look up from her ledger. The second month he stopped trying. He scraped. He carried buckets. He left at noon every Saturday and drove back down the coast to his brother's house in New Haven, and he came back every Saturday at 6 o'clock in the dark, in the cold, with his hands red and split from the salt water. And one morning in the 3rd week of January, Eloise looked out the kitchen window and saw him sitting on the bottom step of the cliff stairs in a wool watch cap with his head in his hands. She did not go down to him. Rosalind, who was at the window with her, looked at Eloise for a long moment. "Let him sit," Rosalind said. "I was going to," Eloise said. He sat for perhaps 10 minutes. Then he stood up. He picked up his bucket. He went back to scraping. In October of that first year, the year Eloise turned 63, she sat down with him on the porch for 1 hour, as she had promised. They talked for that 1 hour about 35 years of marriage with a directness neither of them had ever managed inside it. He did not ask for anything. She did not offer anything. They did not get back together. They had not been pretending to. He told her near the end of the hour that the state attorney general had reached a plea agreement with him in August that he would not be prosecuted, that he had agreed to never again hold a fiduciary position. He told her that his brother had gotten him a job in November doing the books for a small marina in Mystic, Connecticut for $43,000 a year, and that he was going to take it. "Good," Eloise said. "Eloise, yes. Can I keep coming on Saturdays?" She looked at him for a long time. He was 64 years old, and his hair had gone all the way white, and his hands were the hands of a man who had been scraping barnacles for a season, and he was, she understood, asking her for the only thing he had left to ask for. He was not asking for love. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was asking for the chance to keep doing one piece of useful work in his life. "Yes," she said, "you can keep coming on Saturdays." He nodded once. He stood up. He walked down off the porch and across the dirty yard and got into his car and drove away. She watched him go. She watched the rental car. He was still in the rental car. She did not know why disappear into the spruce. She found sitting on the porch in the cooling October light that the thing in her chest that had been clenched since the morning in the kitchen in Greenwich had sometime in that hour let go. She did not know if she would call it forgiveness. It was something quieter than that, and more honest. They were two people who had been married once. They had hurt each other. They were now learning to share a stretch of coast. He kept coming on Saturdays. He still came. In May of that first year, Mayon and Dr. Coraline Whitfield went looking for the small blue. They went at low water on the morning of the 3rd of May. They took with them one of Cordelia's hand-drawn charts of the south end of Mother Cove. They took with them a small clear glass jar with a piece of soft cheesecloth tied over the top. They took with them Pippa Bloomfield, because Pippa had spent 41 years teaching 4th graders how to look very carefully at small things, and Mayon had decided over the winter that Pippa was the best person to have along when you were looking for something you were almost sure was not there. Eloise stayed at the cottage. She did not go down with them. She had her reasons. She did not articulate them to herself in the moment, but she would understand later that she had stayed because she had wanted her grandmother to be the one to find it. She had wanted, if it was there, for it to be found by hands that did not include her own. They came back at 11 o'clock in the morning. Mayon was carrying the jar. She was walking up the dirt road very slowly. Pippa was on her left. Dr. Whitfield was on her right. They came through the gate, and Mayon climbed the porch steps, and she held the jar out to Eloise very carefully with both hands. Inside the jar, in a small bed of damp seaweed, was a nudie branch the size of a thumbnail. It was the color of a summer sky just before dawn. It had 2 small fronds along its back that moved faintly when Mayon tilted the jar. Eloise looked at it. She did not speak for a long time. "How many?" she said finally. "7, said Dr. Whitfield. "We saw 7. 7! They are there. They have been there the whole time. Your grandmother saw them in 1981. They have been there. They are still there." Eloise sat down on the top porch step. She put her hands over her face. She wept. She wept for her grandmother, who had seen them in 1981 and had not been believed. She wept for the letter from the man at the University of Maine, folded inside the journal where the painting of the sea slug was. She wept for Cordelia Thornberry, who had died alone in this cottage in 1998, who had not lived to see her granddaughter come up the dirt road with a deed in a glove compartment, who had not lived to see a young woman from Brunswick stand on her porch with 7 small blue nudibranchs in a glass jar and say, "They are still there." May-on sat down on the porch step beside her. May-on did not say anything. Pebble, who had come out onto the porch when the women had come up the dirt road, climbed into Eloise's lap, and Eloise put her face against the small, warm, white head of the dog, and she wept, and the wind came up off the cove, and Pippa Bloomfield, standing at the bottom of the porch steps with her arms full of seaweed, Samples looked at Dr. Coraline Whitfield, and Dr. Whitfield, who had wept twice that morning at the south end of Mother Cove, looked back at Pippa, and neither of them said anything. The story of the small blue ran in the New York Times on the 14th of May. It ran on the front page below the fold. The headline read, "Lost Species Found Where Maine Woman Said It Would Be 50 Years Ago." The piece, which was written by a science reporter Eloise had never met, named Cordelia Thornberry 7 times, and Eloise Thornberry 3 times, and Dr. Coraline Whitfield twice. It did not name Garrett Halloran at all. NPR did a segment on it the next morning. The BBC ran a piece a week later. A documentary crew called. Eloise turned them down. She turned them down on a Thursday, sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table with the phone in her hand and Pebble at her feet, and when she had hung up, she walked out onto the porch and stood for a long time at the cliff edge. The wind was warm for the first time since October. The cove was the deep, clean green of spring. She could hear from inside the cottage the 4 women laughing about something. She could hear May-on and Dr. Whitfield arguing gently in the back pantry about the proper preservation method for a freshly collected nudibranch. She thought grandmother. She thought, we are not done. In May of the second year, the spring Eloise turned 64. She was invited to give a talk at the New England Coastal Conservation Conference in Portland. She did not want to go. Pippa and Dr. Whitfield insisted. They drove her down the coast in Dr. Whitfield's mud-spattered field truck on a Friday morning in late May, with May-on in the back seat and Rosalind Vance in the passenger seat, and they checked her into a small hotel 3 blocks from the conference center, and Pippa Bloomfield braided Eloise's hair in front of the hotel mirror on Saturday morning with her school teacher's hands. Eloise wore a borrowed gray sweater. She wore her grandmother's brooch, which she had found in the cedar chest under the floorboard, a small enamel piece in the shape of a sea urchin that Cordelia had bought in 1957 with the first money she had ever earned of her own. The conference center was full. 400 people, Eloise was told, marine biologists, conservation officers, 24 members of the press. The keynote speaker who had given the opening remarks the night before was a woman who held an endowed chair at Stanford. Eloise walked out onto the stage in her borrowed gray sweater. She set a copy of her grandmother's first journal on the lectern. She opened it to the painting of the hermit crab, June 1968, 12 panels. She held it up so the room could see it. She waited until they had seen it. Then she lowered the journal and looked out at the room. "My grandmother painted this in 1968, she said. Her voice was steady. It surprised her how steady it was. She was 37. She had no degree. She had no funding. She had no one who took her seriously. She painted it anyway because she loved this coast, and she could see that no one was looking at it carefully enough, and she had decided that she was going to look at it carefully, whether anyone wanted her to or not." She turned the page. She held up the chart of Mother Cove. "My grandmother drew this in 1971. She charted reefs. She charted sea caves. She charted a small cove she named Mother Cove, where she counted 48 seals in 1962 and 4 seals in 1995. She kept doing it for 40 years. She wrote a letter in 1962 to a marine biologist at the University of Maine asking for help with a sea slug she could not identify. He wrote back and told her to consult her local high school biology teacher. She kept the letter. It is still in the journal. I read it last winter. She paused. My husband told me 18 months ago in the kitchen of the house he was about to take from me that I was incapable of changing a light bulb. I was 62. I had spent 35 years believing him in ways I did not realize I was believing him. She looked up from the journal. I want to say something today to anyone in this room who has been told by anyone that her useful life is behind her, that her work does not count, that her grandmother was just a fisherman's wife, that her mother was just a homemaker, that her aunt was just a spinster who painted. She paused. The room was very quiet. We are not finished. We are tide pools. We are full of life that you cannot see from a path. You have to come down to the water. You have to look carefully. You have to stop telling us what we are not and start asking us what we know. She closed the journal. The room stood up. She did not remember afterward how long the applause went on. Pippa Bloomfield, who had been counting from the third row, told her in the car driving home that it had been 3 minutes and 28 seconds. Eloise did not believe Pippa. She did not argue with her because Pippa was not in the habit of being wrong. She walked off stage. Dr. Whitfield was waiting in the wings. Dr. Whitfield, who had wept exactly twice in Eloise's hearing across 2 years, once at the south end of Mother Cove and once on the porch with the jar in her hands, did not weep now. She put a hand on Eloise's shoulder. She said, "Your grandmother is famous now, Eloise." Eloise looked at her. "My grandmother was always famous," Eloise said. "We just hadn't told anyone yet." They drove home that afternoon. They drove up the coast, the four of them in the field truck with the windows cracked for the salt air and the spring light coming long and gold across the water. Pebble was in Pippa's lap asleep. Rosalind Vance was telling a story about her late husband that she had never told anyone about, the way he had once, in 1989, gotten lost in a fog off Mount Desert Island and had spent 4 hours rowing toward the wrong shore and had come home that night and said, "Rosalind, I have decided we are going to have a daughter." They had not had a daughter. They had had 2 sons, both of them grown, now both of them living in Portland. But Rosalind told the story sitting in the passenger seat with the late spring light on her face, and Pippa Bloomfield laughed in the back seat, and Mayon beside her laughed too, and Eloise looked out the window at the long line of the Maine coast running gold and silver under the sun. She thought grandmother. She thought they came, all of them. They came. They came up the dirt road at 6 o'clock in the evening. The cottage was waiting. Isolde Marchetti was on the porch with a glass of wine and her sketchbook. Octavia Penrose was in the kitchen, having driven up that afternoon. The wood stove was burning. The light through the patch window, they had never replaced the patch window. Eloise had decided sometime in February that the patch window would stay forever, was the color of old butter. Eloise climbed down out of the field truck. She stood for a moment at the gate. She looked at the cottage. She thought about a deed in a glove compartment 18 months ago. She thought about a coffee cup rinsed in cold water at a sink in Greenwich, Connecticut. She thought about a woman who had painted a hermit crab in 1968 because no one would do it for her, and who had hidden the painting under a floorboard for 28 years because she was afraid no one would care. She thought about a husband who had laughed at her in a kitchen. She thought about the 7 small blue nudibranches at the south end of Mother Cove. She thought very quietly, "Grandmother, you were right. You were always right." Pebble was at her ankle. The 4 women were on the porch. The wind came up off the cove. Eloise Thornberry opened the gate. She went inside. She was home.